able to welcome Dr. Therese Pearce-Lanella to do a presentation on the topic of promoting democracy in a time of troubles. For those of you who've studied Russian history, the notion of a time of troubles is a familiar one, or smutnaya vremya, and it seems a singularly fitting term to apply to the times in which we're living at the moment, where we're being buffeted by forces, both military and political, in many different parts of the world. To look at the challenges of promoting democracy in such a time, we could hardly find a better presenter than Therese. She is head of the program on electoral processes at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance in Stockholm. 35 member states, of which Australia is one. And I have warm memories of going to the very first presentation that Ambassador Engström of the Swedish Foreign Ministry made in Canberra many years ago, when he was promoting the idea of such an institute as a body that could contribute niche but important expertise to states that were concerned with the wave of democratisation that seemed to be taking shape at the time. With over 30 years of experience in elections and electoral assistance in the field, headquarters and policy levels, Therese's current focus is developing cutting-edge knowledge resources to support a global election practitioner community. Through her previous affiliations with the Carter Centre, the United Nations, the International Foundation for Election Systems, the Organisations for Security and Cooperation in Europe, DFAT here, and the European Union, she has served as project lead or senior expert in international election observer missions, election assistance missions, capacity building projects, and speaking engagements across Africa, Europe, and the Asia Pacific. Her MA degree from the University of Stockholm focused on the links between political financing, corruption, and electoral systems in Japan. And her PhD from the ANU focused on rebuilding trust in electoral institutions. So it's a wonderful pleasure to be able to welcome Therese to address us this evening, and we'll then move into a phase of questions and answers. Therese.
Okay, lovely. And I'll greet those who are online. I can't see who you are, but very, very, very welcome to this as well. So as I was saying in the microphone that didn't work, this talk is at the confluence of three things which are each would take a book or a long time or a lot of many bottles of wine to think through. And one of them is what's going to happen with development assistance more broadly. And the other is what's happening with democracy more broadly. And here I just want to do one plug, shameless. Oh, well, was just about to do a shameless plug for a global state of democracy, but great. Oh, look, I'm good here. I'll give this back to you. Thank you. And then this topic of democracy promotion. So how are we going to do this on a Tuesday evening? Many of you have been at work, and some of you have just had a glass of wine. So I was thinking, how should we do this in a way that feels a little bit compact, but is also a lovely way to spend a Tuesday evening? So with your permission, I would like to tackle these extremely difficult topics through anecdotes and through examples that show some of the concepts that we are talking about, if that's all right. Does that work? Okay. So I was thinking that we could do these troubled times, so I can't say it in Russian, sorry, through a day. I thought we could do a little bit of an inventory of one part of democracy promotion, the part that I know best, which is electoral assistance, through one life. And some of the constraints or things that we would have needed to have been worried about anyways, even without the collapse of USAID, through one budget line item that is often in those electoral assistance projects. Many of you have probably dealt with them, those of you who have been at DFAT. So I was thinking we could do that through those three small stories in these 20-25 minutes. Welcome, Alan, part of this story, a big part of this story. And then I thought the part that we really need to get to, which is the future, I was thinking maybe we could do that together in the question and answer phase. And I'll just give you some prompting framing for that. So, if that works well, I will start with these troubled times. And when I was preparing this intervention today, the heading for this one was What the Just Happened. And the one day was January, late January, and I was in London. And I don't normally have the television on in the daytime, but when I am at a hotel, I just do that to start feeling at home. And on the television was unusually, on the BBC, was live coverage from Auschwitz 80, the 80-year anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it was beautifully done. The coloring was beautiful. The music was beautiful. The world leaders were there in the audience. We had, if I remember correctly, it was King Charles, Macron, Volodymyr's President Zelensky in the audience. But they were listening to the lived experiences of those octogenarian who had lived through the liberation of Auschwitz and heard their stories. This was very sombering. I had just buried my father and my uncle in Estonia. One had fled from there, and the other was a prisoner of war in the Second World War. Vitas, you'll know these parts of the story. And so that idea of the Second World War was this sombering backdrop. But I wasn't there for that. I was there for, and luckily we're not being transmitted much. But I was there for some quiet and informal meetings to meet with civil society, journalists, and academics from India who had experienced some parts of the previous election that had really worried them. And they needed some advice about what this meant. And I need to be very clear here. The stories that they told were shocking, and they also had documentation that they showed. But it was not anything, and here I need to be very, very clear, it was not the Indian Electoral Commission, who I admire, who I work with, and who I believe do an extraordinary job and the best that they can in a very, very complex environment. But what it was local thuggery. And it was ways of making sure people didn't vote, ways of making sure people didn't make it there in all kinds of creative means at the local level. And what it showed was a kind of audacity of political behavior that once might have been constrained, but now wasn't. I'm not saying it was sanctioned, but I'm just saying there was this sense that what once might not have happened was able to happen now. This was a real shock to me because India is one of those places I really admire for their democracy, for their multiculturalism, and I still believe in it. I came home, back to the hotel. The live coverage was still on, to my WhatsApp exploding. So that day, and the reason that I'd come back, we were supposed to be holding a meeting of the Global Network for Securing Electoral Integrity. Some of you at desk here in Canberra at DFAT would have been on that call, as well as people from the AEC, as well as actors globally. Alan, many of your old friends would have been there, people from NDI in Washington, IFAS, UN, Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and so forth. And this is a network that emerged as part of the Summit for Democracy process, realizing that we need to update global norms. Global norms are not keeping up. What we believe about elections is not keeping up with a reality of disinformation, a reality of attacks against election commissions, undermining of the independence of electoral management bodies, reforms that are pushed through in an undemocratic way to benefit the incumbent. And somehow the norms that had been developed many, many years before weren't meeting the needs of the day. And so this global network was formed. And the secretariat was at USAID. USAID was one of those organizations, and here this is a bit of an elegy to, but those of you who are in DFAT will remember that AusAid was, I don't know what it's called, MOGD or whatever. It was combined with DFAT, and this is a trend that's happened in many other countries. This conflation of development, of foreign affairs, and of trade. And I can understand it from a domestic point of view, but it's not very, very helpful when you're out in the field, because what you lose is the expertise that certain people hold, and that expertise informs all of the interventions. Well, USAID had this. They had some of the smartest people in their Center of Excellence on democracy, human rights, and governance. And they were the secretariat for this global network. And suddenly it was canceled with nothing, no reasoning. It was just canceled. And we got this feeling in the pit of our stomachs. Now, we knew that a few days earlier, there was an executive order from Donald Trump that put a pause on all foreign assistance through USAID. But when this sudden muffling came, then we knew that there must be something else wrong. And with this kind of somber background of how the world can change in ways that are very dark, and with this experience that I just had with one of these democracies that I really believed in, and seeing those practices on the ground, suddenly, and the same day, I was, as my WhatsApp was exploding with colleagues from Europe and from ANFREL here in Asia, what is going on? We were trying to think, how do we reach our colleagues in the United States? Can we WhatsApp them? Who owns WhatsApp? Can we write to them at USAID? Who will their emails be checked? Remember that it was Doge or Elon Musk bringing an army of artificial intelligence experts into bring efficiencies. So whose emails are being tracked? And when you don't know how you're going to contact your dear colleagues in Washington, this is this kind of indication that, okay, this is we're in a different league now. Something different is happening. And later, and much later, we were able to, well, we found them through, not knowing what to say and saying things quietly and so forth. But sure enough, they had been utterly humiliated and were basically at home in their pajamas for the next couple of weeks. And now, I should say, are working underground to further the same causes that they were working with. And just as a personal anecdote, but I had this familiar feeling, of how you watch your words. And those of us who have lived in certain countries, my first husband was a Tiananmen era Chinese democracy activist. And so I know what surveillance feels like. And that idea that you're careful about what you say. So this is the era where we are now. So what is it we are losing, and what might well be lost anyhow? I said I was going to tell you the story of one man. And this is, we could tell the story about electoral assistance. Electoral assistance, there is not money for electoral assistance for all the reasons I just said. I need to say one more reason for electoral assistance not being something to count on in the future, which is that as well as the amounts of money being unavailable, there was already a kind of a nervousness about electoral assistance in this democratic environment. And this was for two reasons primarily, and those of you who are at DFAT now may recognize this, less from the Pacific, but very much for those who are working in other parts of the world. And that is, firstly, that you risk legitimizing something that doesn't deserve to be legitimizing, that there are reputational risks of being too closely associated with a very contested election, or that you yourself are seen as the foreign interference, as happened in Tunisia, for example, with support from France and the US, and of course the rumors that it was France and US that had decided the results. So it was starting already to be very thorny for many donors, and they were pulling back. But where did electoral assistance come from? And why is some of it, at least some of it, worth preserving? And here I wanted to tell the story of, and I need just a time check from David there. How am I going? Oh, shoot. Okay. So this is a long story, which I will tell shortly, but I want to tell the story of Rafael Lopez Pintor. And I have a nod from Michael Maley. I could have told Michael Maley's story or Alan's story, but they're here and they can tell you themselves. So I'll tell the story of Rafael. He was a young sociology PhD, I think. If he was young, he wouldn't have been a professor. He was later a professor in Spain in the 1970s. And this was a time of no more Franco. And to my knowledge, and I'm not a historian, but this was one of the first times where a country is actually shopped for its electoral system. It actually was actively out and looking what is available, what institutions, what systems do we put in place for a fair return to democracy. And remember, there hadn't been elections since about the 1930s, maybe 1936. So this is 40 years later, they were really starting with a blank sheet. And so they engineered their electoral system. This is very different from how it happens in most places. And I'll do a plug for Judith Brett's book about Australian democracy called From Compulsory Voting to Democracy Sausage, I think. But it shows, that book, beautiful book, shows how all the features of Australian democracy that you should be rightly so proud of, but they came incrementally as a result of just domestic politics and what was possible at the time. But it wasn't designed necessarily in the way that it turned out. But in Spain, it was. And so Rafael and others of his colleagues ended up with this experience of bringing Spain back to democracy. They ended up traveling around Latin America, because what came next? The need for Argentina and Chile and Nicaragua and Uruguay to come back from authoritarianism. And so what was it that worked? And so these travelers like Rafael went from place to place and learning, and then what they learned in Latin America, for example, the importance of an election management body that was strong enough to withstand the pressures of politicians. So these learnings went from place to place. In the 1980s, Rafael was called to the White House it was actually convened by Ronald Reagan himself, and the dinner was, I think, at the White House, if I recall correctly. And what Ronald Reagan and the State Department at that time wanted to know is, how do we support these democratization processes in a more efficient way? And these are the beginnings of USAID and why the US is really one of the most serious actors in this field. And of course, others have emerged, and Australia absolutely punches above its weight. But USAID the US has continuously had bipartisan support for this kind of democracy assistance. Rafael went on to work with the United Nations, designing some of the key transitions that we've seen in the 1990s. You will have, as did Michael, you'll have come across him in many places. And I think you worked together on Mozambique, for instance. And then he moved into the Arab world space. This is through UNDP, and has for 2 decades now been helping with his colleagues to build up a really, really gorgeous cohort in a regional project that is differentiated from each of its countries, with the basics of election administration. And so that is there now. And that's one of the things that I know he's most proud of right now. Things that were impossible to even mention in the Arab world when he started, like gender, for instance. And they now have like a gender handbook, and they've got handbooks on election administration that are half written by women. So it's these, and I think that I want to tell this story because as we move into this new phase, we mustn't forget that we have these foundations. Compared to the beginning of the 90s, when, or even the 70s, there was no body of understanding of what makes an election work well. So these global norms, these global networks, and when I mention networks, I should also say that these travelers were part of codifying what it means and what we understand for elections to be run very well. And part of that codification is in curriculum, for example, through something that is called the Bridge Project and run out of the Australian Electoral Commission, but is used basically in, I think, 180 countries around the world. This is something to be enormously proud of. And certainly at International ID, I feel very proud of being part of that kind of codifying work, writing down what makes an election work well. And I think I have almost no time left. David, is that right? Fine. Okay. So now I wanted to speak about the line item. So that I've told the day and I've told the life story of Rafael Lopez Pintor to think about these foundations of what we have. But there are things that, as we move forward, we may want to be mindful of lessons that were being learned already before the Ukraine war and already before the collapse of democracy assistance. So there were already issues that needed to be dealt with. And I had the great privilege of being part of the UNDP evaluation of 20 years of UNDP election assistance, DFAT's 2016, 10 years of Australian electoral assistance, and then more recently, a kind of handbook on effective electoral assistance with my colleagues at International IDEA on behalf of an agency in the Swedish government. And I've also been working with the OECD. What comes up again and again, well, there's a number of areas. I'll just pick one, which is technology procurement. And this is just to illustrate the difficulties of doing electoral assistance as development work. Technology procurement is one of those line items that's very popular. It's often a minister, some of you may recognize this, who gets very enthusiastic. It seems, when I say technology, I'm thinking, for example, biometric voter registration or tabulators in polling stations or voting anywhere technology, which means laptops and civil registers in the polling stations. But what we've seen time and time again is, and these are all very, very good technologies, and they work well when they work well. But when they don't work well, it really doesn't. And so technology failure happens when you roll out technology in places where it really the conditions are not good. If it's too hot, if it's too dusty, and this is a ubiquitous problem that happens. It also doesn't work when the technology arrives too late, when people aren't prepared for it. And so this, and technical failures have ripple effects. Second problem with technology is trust. When you introduce it, it seems opaque, and things that are exceptionally popular in one place, think the beautiful voting machines that India is so proud of, introduce it somewhere else, like Botswana, and people are up in arms and wonder, is this a conspiracy theory? Why are you introducing it? And so forth. Dominion voting tabulators, which are used in British Columbia, in Ontario, were the subject of court cases in the United States. So something that seems like a good idea, you get an accurate voters register, you get quick results, or you can allow people to vote anywhere, can be extremely divisive if it is not introduced properly. Final issue with this one line item is sustainability. 4 years later, who's financing it then? Who has the keys to the warehouses? Have you warehoused it properly? We're in an era of climate change. We don't know whether it's going to be wetter or colder or drier. And is the equipment still working? Who has the licenses for it? And remember that there is brain drain from election commissions. That means your chief technical officer from one election is likely being recruited to the private sector, and he's not there for this one. And so I'm saying this to say, as much as I believe in what electoral assistance as one part of democracy promotion has achieved, but this small illustration is just to say there were things that needed to be rethought. So now I come to the part where I need your help, and it is we are at this tabula rasa moment where something will need to be different. Democracy is at a stage which is different from the 90s, or but maybe closer to what Raphael was looking at in the 1970s, which is, rather than focusing electoral assistance or democracy promotion on building institutions or building processes, we are now fully focused on protecting the institutions that we have. This kind of protecting institutions and processes looks different. I don't know what it looks like, but it's a different type of project. It's a different type of financing. So we know we need to protect electoral processes. We're also needing to protect them in our own democracies. So this makes it different from the past. This isn't Western countries being involved to help developing countries. No, this is Western countries, Europe, the States and the United States, in absolute panic about how to protect their own elections from people's anger and distrust, and from harm even to their polling station workers. So this is the new environment that we find ourselves. I have two ideas, but I'll open it up. One is that I think that the future will not be, will be much more of international cooperation on these issues. So it won't be framed as development assistance, somebody helping somebody else. It'll be multiple people going, what are we going to do? So meetings, sharing, those types of things, if we think back on Spain, like that, trying to understand what are ways that somebody else, how have others dealt with a pandemic? How have others dealt with a forest fire? And certainly at International IDEA, that's something we really try to do, is to facilitate those conversations and facilitate those lessons learned whenever we can. The other thing but I think that electoral assistance will still occur. I'm not sure about democracy more widely, but if I just pull out, the reason I'm saying that is there are many parts of democracy promotion which can sound a little bit woke, and at the moment people are terrified of woke, almost everywhere. Some are brave and are not terrified of woke, but any words that seem woke. But elections are a little bit special, and that is because no one wants a failed state at their doorstep. And so if there looks like there's any risks of a country going downwards or something, money will appear to assist. And we can see that with Moldova. Suddenly a lot of money appeared for Moldova. But it's not development money in the traditional sense. It'll be security-oriented money, civil contingency, it'll be sharing understandings of public institutions. And so I think it will look differently, but who will pay for it and how, and who will be the key actors is something that I'll look to you to help us answer. So with that, we can open for any guidance as we move forward. And I should also introduce my colleague Lena here, so we'll be here listening to figure it out. And Alan, who's in the back there, works with UNDP on these issues too. So these are issues that we are figuring out as a community. There's really key organizations like IFAS as well, which many of you have worked with, and NDI, and we're all kind of scratching our heads at the moment to think how we take this forward to build something that will last for the next period. Thank you so much.
Kick off the discussion, Therese, by asking how we go about addressing this last problem we've highlighted, when one of the most problematic states in the world is the United States, particularly at the state level, where it seems more than predictable that, for example, ICE agents will be sent out around Democrat district polling stations at the midterm congressionals and maybe the presidential election in 2028 as part of a voter suppression exercise. What kind of leverage can we hope to exercise in that kind of situation?
Thanks. The US is one of the most absolutely interesting places to watch right now. At the same time as you're seeing this, you are seeing the mobilization locally. And the one that I'm particularly, or at IDEA, and I should say we have an office in Washington as well, that we're keeping very, very, very close eye on, is the local election administrators. If we find innovation in these spaces, it will be there at the state level or even at the county level, because it's very decentralized there, not like here. And so you get, and this is the tool. I think this is our kind of secret weapon moving forward, is this weapon of professionalization, is that a cadre of people in the US who see themselves as election professionals and who will defend the profession. So in the same way that a doctor has an oath to treat anybody, not just the ones who pay, and they will maybe go against influences that are inappropriate, because that kind of professional credo helps them through it. I think that is one of those secret weapons in those increasingly authoritarian environments, that you will organize elections well because it is the right thing to do. And that trend, or that interest in certification, professionalization, is booming in the US right now. And one of the things I have on my plate, and I was just speaking to the acting election commissioner about this the other night, is that in the US, they are extremely interested in this bridge project, which has been used in many other places. And the Australian Electoral Commission, in fact, use it to train their own staff. And this is a curriculum that imbues both the skills that you need to run elections, but also the philosophy, the values, and puts participants into a situation like, what would you do if this happened, or if that happened? But one of the questions is, how do we get something into the United States? Because these old vehicles of development assistance don't apply to the US. And similarly, in Europe, there's extraordinary interest in the types of programs that are normally paid for with money that is meant for somewhere else. So this is an interesting one that is coming up right now. But I think in the US, we'll see people who are brave. We'll see really interesting legislation. So I can just give the example of Colorado, which now has legislation about protecting election officials. This is in the same way that police are protected, have an extra level of protection. If you harm a police person, or if you harm an ambulance worker, it's different from if it's a special category. This is being introduced in Colorado. And in Arizona, for instance, they're now talking about radical transparency. That is letting stakeholders see absolutely everything, including every step of the mail-in ballots. So it's these kinds of practices which I think will influence other places. In the same way that Rafael's experiences from Spain influenced Latin America, I think now it will be these experiments in the US that will influence Europe in the first instance right now. And there's a real interesting conversation going on there.
The floor is open. I might take the liberty of offering some thoughts rather than a question per se, but no doubt you want to respond. One of the things that struck me in your presentation, when you talk about culture on the one hand and technology on the other hand, is the extent to which sometimes technology seeks to be invoked to deal with cultural problems. And I remember well a case when I was still at the AEC, when we had a meeting at USAID where there'd been a proposal from Papua New Guinea to set up a biometric voter registration system. And I well remember saying that it was the formal advice of the AEC that not $1 Australian be put into this, partly because it was unlikely to work, but more particularly because it would amount to accepting the proposition that was coming from the political classes in PNG that their problems were technical, when in fact their problems were corruption of the process by the political class. And so frequently what you see is an attempt to use technology in that sort of context when it's not really the problem. And you have a constellation of interests
to go down that route. You have vendors who want to make money out of selling you computers. You have donors who want to be seen to be contributing to the process by putting in squillions. And you have incumbents who are perfectly happy to see technology rolled out because they know it isn't going to cramp their style at all, but will simply displace, at best, displace their malicious activities into another area of the electoral process. So that sort of brings me back to the issue of culture. When we started really doing this sort of electoral assistance back in the late 80s and early 90s, the focus was almost invariably on institutions, because there was a sense that everyone wanted democracy, that you didn't have to worry about public support, but you had to fix the institutions. And that is fine as far as it goes, but I think the lesson we've learned is that if you don't have the culture to support the institutions, they're not going to survive. The problem there is that institutional building is something you can do quick and dirty. You can have a project for a couple of years with defined performance indicators, which the funders all love. Changing a political culture is not so straightforward. And I used to say to the Australian military, just because a country is in a mess, that doesn't mean that its culture is teetering on the edge of a cliff and you just got to give it a little flick and you can replace it with something else. These cultures are extremely durable. You wouldn't think you could get the mafia out of Sicily by running a 6-month civic education program. And it's the same sort of problem. The trouble is, again, how do you persuade funding bodies to commit to something that's going to take 15 or 20 years and which doesn't have concrete performance indicators that you can come back to for your monitoring evaluation year after year? And that, I think, is the problem we've got ourselves into at the moment.
Thank you so much. I completely agree. I think that one of the things that this is exactly where we are now. It's about culture. It's about behavior that is inappropriate. And so protecting elections now is about, it's not so much about one institution organizing something that is so well run that it will be trusted. That was kind of the idea from the beginning, is that you have a trusted election commission who organizes extremely well a trusted process, and then everybody will trust it. That is not where we are now. We have deliberate undermining. It is in someone's interest that the elections be undermined. And so anything that can be fuel to fuel either some kind of chaos or unbelieving is in someone's interest. And now there is the means to do that through viral internet videos and so forth. And as I was mentioning before in the Indian case, the constraints, and you were mentioning with the United States, the constraints on political behavior, there was the types of behavior we're seeing now. It's not that it didn't exist in people's minds before. There's always been somebody who doesn't want the election results to be in a certain way, but it's the constraints on their behavior that is going away. And so we see a real rise in interest now in codes of conduct. And even here in Australia, which is really one of the highest performing electoral democracies in the world, if not the highest. But if you look at the JSCAM submission that the Australian Electoral Commission put in this week to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, one of the things they brought up was this cannot be on the Australian Electoral Commission alone. There must be a spreading of the responsibility for how behavior is, what a civil electoral process looks like, including amongst the political parties and those other members of society, is we need to spread this load more. I had the pleasure of working in Iraq now. And I think it, in some ways, it exemplifies everything that you just said, Michael. So Iraq was a huge beneficiary of electoral assistance. Talk about squillions. So after the Iraq War, it was incumbent upon the U.S. especially, but also others, to make sure that Iraq didn't fail. There was no lack of resources to make sure that it did not fail. It was not allowed to fail. All of that is gone. If you go to the Iraqi Election Commission now, they're suddenly standing there all by themselves. The UN left now. The UNDP is still there as an organization, but their election assistance program is gone, and IFAS is gone. And IFAS who have supported them throughout, and suddenly they are standing there. The Iraqi Election Commission is all lawyers and judges. That's how they structure their commission, as in Egypt. And these judges are not accustomed to being out in the media, to doing the political communication. And that is one of the challenges that they're seeing now, is this need for allies, that if they make a decision, that somebody else supports that decision elsewhere. And so these are the challenges that they are facing at the moment. And the pressures on them are enormous, both domestically, but also in terms of foreign interference, people wanting this Iraqi democracy project not to succeed. So this is where we are right now. There are no squillions anymore. And the issue is it's not that they can't organize elections well. They organize elections excellently. It is this problem of acceptance in the community and having buy-in, and accepting the result of the elections afterwards in a peaceful way. So this is our big challenge moving forward. Jane and David.
Thank you so much for a terrific discussion and stories. Therese, we in DFAT a few years ago, I was in charge of Western Europe, and we brought Art O'Leary, the Irish commissioner, out to Australia, and so he could mingle with his good friend Tom Rogers, who's a great part of our history here as well. Art talked a lot then about the Irish ability to run citizens' forums. And this is a very important and unique, perhaps to Ireland and to some other small countries, efforts to grow civic culture around, in that case, it was referendum questions. And of course, we've had our own referendum here, and it's been difficult. Very few referenda have passed, etc. In very orderly, shall I say, smaller countries like Ireland, perhaps in Australia, this has been done at the state level sometimes. Certainly, I think in the Nordic states, there's a good record of doing this as a way of building civic culture. Is it still possible in the age of, you know, online bullying and social media and digital attempts to sway populations and mount kind of insurgencies at the street level? Is it still possible, do you think, to run such things around referenda questions or any other element in the electoral process? I would imagine this is going on in parts of the United States even as well, but it seems to me that it's a very difficult time to do such a kind of grassroots civic culture building through citizens' forums.
Thank you. Actually, interesting civic forums and deliberative democracy and a whole bunch of events like that are actually my industry. There's a lot of work that's being done in that space. Interestingly, one of the organizations that's really bad at inspiring and procuring it is government, because the procurement processes that government has to go through pretty much prevent any of that actually being bought, which is one of the really significant barriers to being done well. There's actually a lot of organizations being set up playing in that space. My question, Therese, was actually inspired by the earlier comment. Like obviously you've talked about countries that are going through different experiences and different points in their own, I guess, democratic process, but is there a macro cycle that's going on at the moment? Like, have we seen this point, like, sure, we've got technology and social media, a whole bunch of different things now, but is there a bigger cycle that goes on around democracy and stability of countries and these types of electoral processes that you're aware of, that we're kind of sitting in and maybe can't see the forest for the trees?
David's first because it's hardest, is just this is something we haven't seen before. Everything, any kind of cycle that there's been is faster and faster and faster now. But I would look to Alexander Stubb. He's the Finnish president, Trump's golfing buddy, but is actually one of the smarter people around. And he talks about these cycles of chaos, and inside the chaos, people being worried and having conversations, and this speaks to Jane's point, in a chaotic environment like the Second World War, which we mentioned before, or the First World War for that matter, those were the seeds for what became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or all of the so-called world order that we're worried about right now. So inside the chaos is an enormous vibrant discussion that is all over the place until it starts to coalesce, and then you start getting order again. So that's the Alexander Stubb version. And that I find a little bit inspiring, because it means that these very strong, like, what must we do, this Tolstoyan angst, but it's those conversations bring the seeds for what is coming next. And part of the seeds, I think, is exactly what Jane has just said, is that we may need to do democracy differently. We may need to work in the spaces that are open to us, and conversation is a huge part of that it's not just technical. And I think Ireland is very inspiring. You said, you spoke of Ireland as being stable. It's not stable. Ireland is one of the most troubled, historically one of the most troubled ones. So and issues like abortion and gender, which is what they've had initiatives around, these citizens' initiatives. It's an extraordinary way to take a toxic conversation and bring it into a civil space. And in fact, exactly this was recommended in advance of the Voice referendum. Michael, you were there at the Election Regulation and Reform Network, ERN. Anyways, there's a gorgeous network where academics and election practitioners meet. And at that one, there was a proposal put forward from the academic side, which was saying exactly this, that for the question on the referendum, why don't we have a citizens initiative, and gave examples of how this had been done also in the United States on the West Coast, I think in Oregon. And one of the problems was just Australian legislation, and Australian legislation creates a binary. So a referendum is equal. The sides are necessarily equal. But if you look at the Irish legislation, it doesn't ask you to do that. So it doesn't ask the Irish Election Commission to present both sides equally. It just has to present it truthfully. Because sometimes there are referendums that are just a natural progression of society. I think in the Supreme Court of the US, I'm not a lawyer, but they call it something like the pub test. But when it's the consensus that all of society would agree that this is the right way to go. And in those cases, do you really need to have a binary referendum? So these techniques that we've learned, referendums and elections and so forth, each one is useful for something. Elections are really important for political transitions that are orderly. Referendums may or may not be appropriate for divisive issues. I would argue that they might not be, unless something has to be decided. So we have to be more creative, and part of that creativity is going to be conversations and deliberative, I hope. Yeah.
Just a quick question that flows from what you were saying about Iraq. One of the things that strikes me is that very often by the time decisions are being made about the establishment of election management bodies and some of the technical mechanics of electoral administration, there have already been decisions made about the broader character of an electoral system that can swamp the best efforts that might arise from election professionals. I'm thinking of the use of list proportional system on a nationwide basis in Iraq, which almost guaranteed that identity politics would surge up as a result of the election, or the choice of single non-transferable voting in Afghanistan, which filled the legislature with independence and set the scene for rent-seeking and network politics, which again overwhelmed the democratic aspirations of the people who were designing the systems. Is that a challenge with which professional election administrators are always going to have to struggle to some extent?
The legacy issues of systems that were designed for one reason and are no longer fit for purpose is myriad. And I'll give Bosnia as another case where they're living with a solution that was necessary to get out of a war, but didn't have a sunset clause. But there's also dangers of flip-flopping and changing your election system all the time. And we've seen that in Fiji, and it's the sense that it's up for grabs. So how to reform something is a very is something to be very careful and mindful of. And one of the reasons that we've put out guidelines, this global network that I was telling you about before, it will reappear like Phoenix from the ashes without USAID. But one of the guidelines was about electoral reform, and it was precisely because it was like, if you are going to reform something that needs reforming because it isn't serving its purpose, the problem now is we are in an environment that is absolutely toxic, where anything you introduce will be politicized, even if it's introduced for reasons that make sense. So to be wary of that, introducing something that has unintended consequences. That is, if you switch from one system to another, there might be unintended consequences of that other one. But then also the being too, so I'll give you the example of the Netherlands now, where a minister decided that there should be an election system change. And it was a small one, but nonetheless, the bureaucrats were really, really concerned and said, is this okay? And it shouldn't be. So, but to get the political consensus to change something that needs to change something. So on the one hand, it shouldn't be ordered because it's the right thing to do. But on the other hand, getting the consensus to change anything at this point in time is going to be really, really difficult. Yeah. So I have no easy answers. If something was designed badly from the beginning, you kind of stuck with it because changing it's really, really difficult until there's a chaos and tabula rasa, like the Spanish case that I said, when you get to go from a blank slate, but usually it's not possible.
And I think the last question.
Yeah.
Again, it's an observation, but one of the problems that you sometimes strike is that from the outside, people think electoral assistance and electoral expertise is homogeneous. Whereas in fact, you may get people who are extremely good on election logistics, but have no clue about electoral systems. And in particular, when you're talking about choice of electoral systems, it's not just a matter of understanding the systems, but it's understanding how they will operate in the context of a particular country and that country's culture. And I can give you an example of East Timor, where I was fairly recently, where they have what they call a closed list system of proportional representation. You literally cannot vote for a candidate. You can only vote for parties. And then the people who get into the parliament are off the party list. And Americans tend to be shocked by this and say, well, who's going to be your local representative and all that sort of thing. The advantage of it is that it doesn't create an incentive for vote buying by individual candidates, which is what has ruined elections in Papua New Guinea, in much of Melanesia. And that, to me, is one of the great strengths of what they've done in Timor, that they have avoided that problem. As it happens, it's also an extremely networked society, so people have all sorts of ways of getting their local concerns heard at the national level. They're not just dependent on members of parliament. But if you just go in with a handbook saying, here are the impacts of this system or that system, you very well can come up with something that is not going to work well in a country, and that's when you wind up having to change it all the time. And also how a system works isn't just a matter of its inherent features, but also how political players adjust their own strategies in response to the opportunities which a system provides.
Well, thank you, Therese, for a stunning presentation. It's one of the great virtues of the Institute that we're in a position to provide a platform for expert visitors who can discourse on a range of different topics, and we're very much dependent upon that generosity of spirit for our capacity to share with our audience new perspectives on issues that are crowding in around us. So it's a great pleasure to be able to thank you once again and give you a small gift in appreciation of your contribution. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And you'll receive notification about our next meeting fairly shortly. We certainly have Dr. Al Palazzo on the 4th of November, who's talked about issues relating to Australian defence policy. Yeah, so good. Thank you very much.